The more evidence, the better, I say.
I mean, this is so improbable.
That's a bold statement.
I mean, I think that's a fair point, but I didn't make that argument. He did.
Why is that true? Is that a good question? Maybe it's not.
Drew, you're not supposed to ask good questions like
sorry,
that.
sorry.
Ask difficult questions.
Bill, jump in here.
I'm Bill the Christian.
And I'm Drew the Skeptic.
You're listening to The Divide.
Okay, welcome to The Divide. This is Bill, and today Drew and I are doing something special in that we're just going to talk to one another, sort of interview one another about the question, what are the biggest factors that shape our fundamental view of the world? And we really have had a difficult time trying to agree on a format. Not we haven't had any arguments about it, but we just trying to agree on a sensible way to approach this question. I think Drew has been its own challenge. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, I agree. I think it's been sort of a step back from what we usually talk about, where we're not talking about a particular issue that we feel differently on, and there's a divide on that. We're trying to think about how we view reality itself, right?
Yeah. So one thing we thought would be helpful for people listening and helpful for ourselves as well is to talk a little bit about the yardstick that we use to approach all the different kinds of evidence or factors that would play into our view of the world, particularly our theistic versus a non-theistic view. And I think, by the way, also I'll just say preliminarily, Drew, that I think one of the challenges for this, for me personally over the years, has been that when I think about things like this, I find myself having to deliberately try to stop being impressive. You know, that I want to find something that sounds really good, and I'm afraid of not having something good, to say. So, and I think it's a really bad method, to try and find something that sounds good rather than just the truth of, you and I already have a view of things. It's more productive, I think, just to try and figure out why we really do have that view and not try and artificially construct some reason behind that. So
I think my temptation was to try to classify everything, and when you sort of look at that and do a little reading, it's like maybe these ways of classification aren't the best. So I think simplifying it to a particular question like we have agreed on is probably a good idea, and just trying to think about what shapes our view of the world, what shapes our view of reality, and just limiting it to that, and not trying to bring in all the different branches of philosophy or anything like that, but just, what is the yardstick that helps us even measure, shape that view or come to that view.
Yeah. So what would be the first thing, or one of the first things that comes to your mind that you would say is a key part of your yardstick?
So at the top, I think I'd have to put just experience. Kind of the first thing that came to mind for me was the old Descartes quote, "I think, therefore I am." And it's like, that's kind of what starts, that's kind of where any inquiry has to start for me, because it really is a case, and experience has taught me this, not surprisingly, that anything else we start with can be undermined. And I think that's sort of the experience that he had when he was trying to sort of prove things that he could find, things that he could prove. And so when I'm trying to find, when I'm trying to ask the big questions about reality, like what is real and what is made up, what can we know, what can't we know, that sort of thing. I always go to experience first, because I find that whether it's sort of something that's just empirically proven, like in science, or if it's something that I kind of have to learn in the old school of hard knocks, or whether it's just sort of reasoning. If I don't really experience it firsthand, firsthand may not be the right way to phrase that, but if it's not part of my experience, it's not something I feel I can be very confident about.
So I think I would say a similar thing. I wonder if we're going to be about the same on this, or if we're just using the terms but meaning it a little differently. In other words, maybe I'm using a metric stick, not a yardstick. But but I would say that's also true for me too. That I like to think that I start not necessarily with sensory experience, which I think is what you were trying to say. It's not, you just don't limit yourself only to that. But I like to think that whatever strikes me as being real, as sort of being obviously real, is kind of the starting point for how I would look at anything. In other words, I don't want to feel like my first step or the whole way I'm going to even begin to investigate the question of God or the question of the nature of reality itself. That I don't want to feel like I'm immediately, leaping blindly off of something that doesn't even immediately relate to my real everyday experience. So I'm curious if we really mean the same thing when we're saying this.
Well, it sounds like we agree on sort of the object here, which is reality. I mean, we don't have a way of approaching the world that's sort of ambivalent or doesn't care about what is real. Like, we both want to know not things that are made up or that change from day to day, but we have this idea that there is a fundamental reality that whether we even can know it or not, we kind of have this idea that
Mm-hmm.
that's sort of the object we're going after, and we just got to figure out what the best way is to know what that, to figure it out.
So even in my, sorry.
So I guess you were saying you experience is a big one for you too when it comes to even seeking out what is real.
Yeah, I was going to say that even in my sort of atheist when I was younger, I remember writing a paper in my first year of university on how belief in God is no different from belief in Santa, and what was common about me at that time and the way I think about things, or the yardstick I use, what was common then, as is with me today, is that I really did care about the truth. Like I was wanting to know the truth. I sort of expected the truth to be out there in some way, and I felt like that, like no one had to persuade me. I don't think usually people are interested in believing lies, right? Like, we seem naturally just predisposed to want to know the truth about things. So that's one thing I think I share. And I think, by the way, generally, that I always feel comfortable when I'm talking to, whether it's atheists or anybody, whatever their religion, philosophical view, if they share that. When I talk to people that seem sort of apathetic about that, I find myself struggling a little bit. If they seem too sort of shrug of the shoulders about whatever the truth ultimately is, then I think that's something I don't relate to as much. We may not know it. We may not be able to know it right now, but I always feel like, but doesn't it matter at least? So.
Yeah, I kind of agree with that. I've always kind of been frustrated by the idea that, if you don't believe in a God or even a creator, then you can't have an appreciation for absolutes, or the idea that something is just objective and real. So
yeah.
So I think we're coming from the same page on that one.
So one thing I'd add into this that I'm not sure you'll agree with is that I also default to the assumption, so it's just, I guess, an a priori thing, that the world is rationally ordered or fundamentally ordered, so that there really is, in other words, to me, just in practical terms, it seems like every person assumes at least 100 times a day that the world around them is rationally ordered, if not 1,000 times a day. So that decisions you make constantly every day of your life are assuming the world is fundamentally rational. And so I take that as a kind of, that's maybe part of my yardstick, that it sure appears to be understandable and ordered in a rational way. and then I sort of start from there. And I don't. It's not that I don't think there might be some things we could never understand, but I just. It's not. I would more think of it as something we don't understand rather than it's irrational. How do you?
That's
how do you
interesting.
think of that?
Yeah, and so you're not necessarily saying that there is a purpose, or that's not what you're incorporating into this statement about the world being rational. You're just saying that things are sensical or can be made sense of.
Yeah, exactly. That I assume it's there. In other words, like to me, what would be the point of being an economist or a scientist or a politician or anything if you didn't assume at bottom that you were looking for an answer that is there, that there is something ordered and explainable. I sort of.
I think I have to agree. Like when we read, Sherlock Holmes or whatever, he's not. When he's trying to put the pieces together, he's not saying, well, I'm gonna take all these things that could be clues and throw them to the side because they're not part of the rational scheme. It's like everything that happens is weighed into account, and you try to tell a story that makes sense because we assume that things make sense.
Yeah, that the person's not dead for no reason whatsoever.
Exactly. Yeah, there's not
the victim is dead for a reason.
There's not an irrational reality that's just non-factor, a non-caused. I don't know what I'm trying to say, but yeah, you said it best.
So the other thing I would say before we at least pick one specific factor, that when I think of these different factors, I sort of think of them like imagine if you buy a house and there's no tree in your yard and there's no one really that near you, and you're digging to build a garden or to plant a garden, and you hit a root that's a pretty substantial tree root, and you look around and you think there's not a tree within 100 feet of this place, and then you go 3 feet and you hit another root. What I sort of view my encounter with the evidence around me in this way, where it's like I'm encountering things, and as I encounter them and try and explain them, I assume there's something rational to explain them, and I think, well, I guess in my analogy or illustration, there obviously was a tree here. They must have cut it down and they ground the stump and then they planted over it or whatever. So you can't see the tree anymore, but it was once here, and all these roots were going to some nearby trunk. And so that would be sort of like a way I think of the compilation of evidence that I collect, and I feel like I'm like when I hit different parts of my experience, I think, well, if I pick this root up and then encounter this root and then I encounter another one over here, it seems like they lead to a common source. For me, it's God. That ultimately God makes sense of explaining all of these different roots in the ground, and so I see continuity in the different things I encounter. I don't know if it might make more sense if I come back to that later, but anyway, that would be one way I tend to sort of view even though there's different types of evidence that lead me to believe that God is real and God is sort of fundamental to the universe. It's like I'm picking up different thing. I'm encountering different things, but they're going to a common source.
So it's a cumulative sort of idea of what's leading you. It's not like you had. There's not like a missing link type of thing where here's the jewel of wisdom or whatever that I found that made it all come together. Like the missing puzzle piece. It's more of a
the capstone, the skeleton key. It's not. I don't think of it as God of the gaps. I think of it more like, well, all of these different things I'm encountering make sense together. They make sense individually, but they end up leading to the same source. But we can go on as to whether that holds true across the different factors we could get to at some point. I wonder if we should just take one that, like for me, in other words, let's move on from yardstick to just a specific thing, a factor in why I think the way I do about ultimate reality.
Yeah, go ahead.
So and I say this one as being maybe one of the first ones because I don't think it's the kind of thing that I think would impress at all a person who doesn't already believe. But I think it's true. And I certainly wouldn't have thought of this before I came to believe in God. So that this is, it's a sort of inside the tent kind of answer, I think. But it's the truth nonetheless. And that is, I'd call it awe. I think C.S. Lewis wrote something about this, but I think he called it joy, or I may be wrong about that, but I think his autobiography or his conversion story is called Surprised by Joy, and I think it has something to do with this. But I haven't read that whole book, and it's been years anyway, so I don't know if it's the same thing. But all I mean by awe is very simple. I'd give two simple illustrations of it. One is the first time I saw the David in Florence, in Rome, the famous sculpture of the David, is, even though obviously I already knew about Michelangelo and so on, but just in seeing that sculpture, I was immediately impressed, way beyond what I was expecting to, since I'd already seen 100 pictures of it and just kind of assumed I would just see it and then move on to the next thing. But seeing it live impressed me and grabbed me, and I was just immediately impressed. And by that I mean I had a sense of awe for who made it. So I didn't, in other words, I've seen sculptures. I could do this with other sculptures where I have no idea who made it. Ancient Roman, Greek sculptures, we don't know who the sculptor is. But I see it and I just immediately am in awe of not just in awe of the actual, the statue. I'm impressed with who did it. And I don't think of it as like a logical argument I'm making. I'm not trying to say, hey, I could prove that some person who's a genius made this. It's not like I go through steps to arrive at this sense of awe. It's just an immediate, intuitive wow. And the wow isn't the thing that's there. It's that I know it's a product and I'm in awe of its maker. So that would be one illustration I would use for it, is that when I came to believe in God, then I felt a sense of awe, and now when I think of belief in God, I tend to think of it as, well, probably like it's a very deeply psychological, emotional, I definitely think belief in God is not something you do merely by intellect. In fact, I don't even think it makes sense to do it merely by intellect, because if God really if God is real and he made every fiber of our being, it only makes sense that every bit of us, emotions, psychology, intellect, and so on, would come to that conviction. But so anyway, that would be one thing. And the other way I would describe it is like I had a friend who was adopted when he was young, and then when he was just out of college, I think, he went and found his birth mother, his biological mother, who lived in another state, and went and met her for the first time, and he gave the story like you've no doubt heard many times, which is there's an immediate connection that he felt with her, his biological mother, that, even though he didn't really know her at all, when he first met her, there was just an immediate sense of connection or awe of this person, that he came from her, and there's this deep, deep relationship to her. So that would be my, I kind of put that up as, I don't think belief in God is only an intellectual thing for sure. And I think for me, that was and continues to be a big part of I don't think I ever would have come to belief in God without that. So I think that's probably, I'll list that as number one as a factor. I don't feel like, by the way, I strategized to get that. I don't feel like I was, trying to arrive at something, to believe or whatever. I just think it came with whatever at that point, so many years ago when I came to believe in God, that sort of just seemed to come along with it. So that would be.
I'm intrigued. I guess I have questions. I mean, I'll use your first example of the David. I'm not one who really has an eye or a knack for visual art, but I do I've definitely had that sort of same experience, I think, where I've either both with music and poetry. So I've read Shakespeare,
Yeah.
and I've just sat dumbfounded and thought, how is this the product of a human being? You know, and
Yeah.
then I've listened to music that I just thought, you know, that as one who's dabbled in music, it's like, man, that's it's just humbling to sit there and listen to something you'll never be able to do. and and so in that sense, the product immediately screams of the person who created it. But that to me, that's just a sort of reasonable and not, I don't attribute any sort of extra category to that, other than just a natural appreciation for something aesthetically beautiful. So I guess my question is, do you ever consider that maybe it's just that, or is there something to the awe concept that I'm just missing entirely?
Yeah, and that's why I tried to give the second one illustration to help it a little more along, because that connection you have with your biological parent is, or with like a twin sister you hadn't met or whatever,
But like assuming I could
those sorts.
come up with and I'm sure there are other examples too, and so assuming I could come up with okay, well, here's the explanation for that, it has something to do with, biology and first memories and blah, 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 assuming I could sort of, and I'm sure I could try, argue against each example of awe. Is there a main thread that I'm missing throughout, or do you just think it's either you see it or you don't kind of thing?
I do. Yeah, I think probably in the end that's it. And in other words, I wouldn't offer it as an argument, just more of just an honest explanation of my own belief. I don't have any doubts at all, by the way, in terms of my analogies, that there are perfectly reasonable explanations, including biological ones and so on, for your connection to your parent. It's not that I don't think those things themselves have certain obvious explanations. I'm only offering them as, it's like this, That's what I would think of it as being like. But of course, God is in his own category. I mean, God is the source of all being, the very existence of anything, a bottle cap, your carpet, your pet, it's just the universe, as in terms of its fundamental laws and so on. So I just sort of think of it. I'm only trying to offer analogies, and I don't think there's anything quite else. There's nothing else that really is obviously going to be quite like it, just because he's in his own category.
This is almost the point, honestly, where I wish we had a guest who could. I would love to hear someone else react to this idea, because I think that a lot of people would probably, maybe even intuitively know what you mean. And the closest I can think back to is when I was, when I would, pray and go to church and that sort of thing. There was this sort of, the chill bumps phenomenon, where you would feel like, oh wow, I just really experienced something there, that I've also had. I must throw in there at, a great concert or something like that. And so it's that's sort of the only thing that comes to mind, I guess, when I think about this idea of awe. And obviously the examples I said already. And for some reason, I just, it doesn't immediately resonate with the way you're talking about it. So I think
and of course, awe. That's a good point. And of course, what I wouldn't want to do, and this is the problem with it, is where it's just going to be a difference, for sure. I don't expect you to directly relate to, although you kind of relate to it from before, is I would say, like, if it's not, I don't mean it in some sort of like deep emotional sense. I don't mean it in some artificial what do you want to call it? Like, like a wow factor that people have when they, are blown away by something they weren't expecting. Like whatever American Idol, someone goes up and sings and you think they're not going to be good, and then suddenly they just blow the roof off with their talent. I don't mean it in any of those ways. Those are at best rough analogies of what I would call some type of aha, things work together. I'm satisfied. I'm impressed. I'm grateful. However, I just chose the word awe because that was the best one I could come up with at the time.
I can tell it's pretty difficult to describe, and that's what's making me think. I wonder if I would sympathize.
Yeah, because what else is like it?
Yeah, I wonder if I would sort of, share this experience more if I understood exactly what you meant by it, but probably not.
Well,
I think there's a good chance that's a divide, that's a difference between us. But
yeah, but I mean, you could think. Don't you think you could, as a let me say this much? Couldn't you say, well, let's say you discovered that you had been planted here by extraterrestrials, like you were. This is like it wasn't a movie, sci-fi movie. It was reality. Like Drew, some UFO ship comes down and directly, you interact with it personally, and the creatures that come out of it, and they tell you this is who you really are, and we're the ones that planted you here on Earth or whatever. I mean, you can at least imagine how that would be like, oh, well, that makes sense of some things, that I always kind of wondered about. Like, in other words, it would tie together some loose ends for you that you had deep questions about or what have you. So I think you could at least relate to that much, right? I mean, the idea of it sort of tying together lots of loose ends.
I guess I can fathom. So, I mean, I'm thinking about your example. I'm like, I wonder if that would bring up more questions than it tied up. But yeah, something I can certainly imagine a scenario where that could be possible.
Yeah, I mean, it's just by the way, no different from if you were adopted and your parents at some point, tell you when you're 18,
yeah,
or
something
16 or whatever,
something that's legitimately life changing.
Yeah. And you're like, oh, well, that suddenly makes sense out of who I am in ways that I kind of felt underneath the surface, but couldn't quite put it together. And so that's my word. My word is awe, because I think it's more than just an intellectual sudden awareness. It's more profound than that. That's why I'm trying to stay away from just saying, it's just suddenly everything made sense, because I think it's more than that. But at the same time, that I think is a big part of it. I don't, by the way, again, I'll just emphasize, I wouldn't offer this as a reason for why someone else should believe in God or expect anybody to be persuaded, and certainly not you, that I know for a fact that it sounds like, I've got my little invisible friend and there's really literally nothing you can do to refute it. So it's kind of like, okay, fine. But I also felt like, as I started this conversation, you can either say what you think is what you just think would be the kind of impressive thing for someone else, or just sort of say the truth about what is one of if not the biggest factors that shape why you believe what you do. And I think for me, this is definitely one of them. In other words, I'm obviously going to go on to list other things, other factors that I think are going to be much more, I think, arguable. Objectively arguable. But I think even if we went through 8 or 10 or 12 different things and went through all of them, I think I probably still feel like in order to come to believe in God, for me, it had this element of what I'll call awe is I think inseparable from it. That if you're really going to come to believe in God, it's going to involve this sort of denouement, great, what you might call the grand resolution to your very being and existence, and that I think is certainly something to be in awe of. So, yeah.
I think it's interesting because everything I think of is is sort of a smaller version of that. But just, basically, I think back to math class, like in high school, when you would be struggling to sort of understand a concept, and then it would finally, something would click, and the pieces would fall in place, and you would have the sort of just the moment you were talking about where, oh, it all makes sense now because of something that I grasped that I wasn't grasping before. And while obviously I've had that experience in those minor ways, I think in a more major way, when it comes to how I view and understand the world, it's been more of a lack of awe. By that I mean the things that that were more fundamental even than math that I thought I knew and I thought I had an explanation for, I have subsequently found more reasons to doubt. And I've found more reasons to believe that we need to think more probabilistically than we do need to think in terms of certainty. I won't get into too much about why, but I think a fundamental thing for me has been realizing, I don't think that I can really say I'm 100% sure of anything, other than possibly that I exist because I am thinking these thoughts and saying these words, But I mean,
by the way, I absolutely loved that you just said the only thing you're 100% certain of is that you possibly exist.
so yeah, that pretty much says it all.
Point made.
Like the skepticism is based on that really lack of the awe concept about anything. What's the word I'm looking for? Like I would say, maybe that the math example from high school would be like a minor awe, but it's not.
Right.
But it's not in any way a comprehensive. It's not an awe that's joining, or it's certainly not as you described, a finding a root and another root, and then having having it dawn on you that there was a tree that that it's more of a finding a root and then finding an old tire and then finding and then finding something completely different, not leading towards, oh, this was a junkyard, or oh, this was a tree and a playground.
What property did you buy?
Right. But just, then a nugget of gold, then an old, animal bones, then just, what is this place? What is this? And that's actually a pretty good, allegory for my way of viewing the world. It's like, I don't see the pieces locking into place in the way that you've described. So I think we already have a divide here. So, and maybe that should be the episode. We're already coming up on time anyway, I think. But
I think that's really good. I think that's this is clearly part one.
I wasn't planning on even sort of responding to your first point that way, but I do think it kind of ended up being almost that seamless, where it's awe versus lack of awe. It's the clicking into place of things versus that not happening. And
which makes sense, because I'm claiming to know obviously my claim is that I know some deep fundamental truth, right?
Right.
So it ought to lock into place.
And
since you don't claim it, it shouldn't.
Right. You wouldn't expect skepticism from someone who had that experience. So yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I'm sure we'll find interesting ways to go from there. But
by the way, I would agree. I would agree with you that as far as certainty, that I'm with you in terms of about sort of 100% certainty. I don't think that's really achievable, just because I think our minds are fundamentally imperfect. They're highly productive and efficient in a lot of ways, but I don't think they're perfection. So since the apparatus or the tool we use has some problems with it, then I wouldn't think like certainty is achievable no matter what, even on my side, sort of what, just because of the nature of I don't think I can just say based on my mind alone, I can arrive at some great
That's
truth.
actually interesting to me, and that's something maybe we'll get into next time, because I do think some Christians would say certainty can be, though not a human thing, it can be sort of given by God. And maybe I do too. I don't know, but I do.
I think I might call it assurance. Which I still think is, for all practical purposes, certain. I mean,
an extrinsic certainty that you can't be sure you're interpreting correctly or whatever.
In the philosophical sense, I don't think so. I'm with you on that. Well, great discussion. I really enjoyed this, Drew.
Yeah. I hope listeners will enjoy it, and maybe we'll get some feedback and see if we need to do a part 2.
Yeah, sounds good.
We got one divide in the books. So.
There you go. All right, this has been Bill the Christian.
And I'm Drew the Skeptic. Thanks for listening.
The Divide is produced by Alan and Ben Hawbrooks and edited by John Workman. Dalton Reed handles IT. Join us for further discussion on this topic at our subreddit, TheDividebyiPUB. To learn more about other episodes and who we are, check out ipub.org/thedivide. See you next time on The Divide.